All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. This is Jen Shonger from the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, the NJACE, which is funded in part by the New Jersey Governor's Council and the New Jersey Department of Health. I'm super excited to be here today with Jennifer White, who just has profound wisdom to share with all of us. And before I introduce her, I wanted to go over a couple of our housekeeping notes. We're live on YouTube right now. The replay is available at any time. And it'll be available to watch with both Spanish and English captions, as well as a transcript. We will actually also make a second version of this webinar that has ASL. So we will let everyone know when that's released as well. If you are catching the replay, I guess you'll probably realize this as you're watching, but you can fast forward the waiting room if you just want to get to the beginning. And as always, we encourage you to ask any questions that you have. You just have to be logged into your YouTube account. We would love to know more about you. So if you're comfortable, please feel free to let us know a little about yourself there. So now I'm so excited to introduce Jennifer White, who's the CEO of Able Opportunities, Inc., which she's also a special education teacher, subject matter expert for the Department of Labor, a corporate disability inclusion specialist, and National Technical Assistance Consultant. Her experience includes collaboration with teams across classroom, residential, community, and work support systems. Her background includes university research, collaboration to honor and include the culture of First Nation peoples, and cross-agency projects serving people with intellectual developmental disabilities. Her drive to level the playing field with appropriate accommodations has resulted in decades of innovation, and her enthusiasm based in functional solutions is contagious. And I know that you'll all agree as soon as you start hearing from her. So with that, thank you so much for being here, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be connected with you and doing this today. Hello, everyone. That was a great introduction. It summed me up fairly well. I'm going to give you just a quick other bit of more information and then launch into our work here today. I started in the field at 13 years old. My dad's a Freudian child psychiatrist who was working in colleges and developmental centers, and he would drop me off at Lehigh University from the East Coast, yay, and say, watch this teacher, hang out with this child. Here's a boy with autism, when it meant something very different than the spectrum that we have now. And so I learned from children right out the gate. And the thing that fascinated me immediately were kids who struggled with communication, because communication is power. And when you don't have power, then you have behavior, and then behavior is being traded, but the communication issues weren't being treated as effectively. And, you know, we've all done the best we can. I understand that. And my focus has been the how to level that playing field around a communication system or strategies that move beyond just behavioral response to behavior. So that's what a lot of this is born of. It's been influenced by people that I serve. I have worked primarily with people with very significant disabilities over the years, but I've had the great pleasure of being very passionate about what I do and working with children and adults of all ages. So this is going to be an overview that touches on a little bit of everything. All right, ready to go? Here we go. Okay, so I coined the phrase person-driven based on the fact that we have been working so hard on person-centered tools, which is vital. We've always needed it. And excuse me. And what I find is in our field, whether we're working with children or adults, our system is based on my relationship with somebody. In fact, how I became a communication specialist was people would say, oh, call Jennifer. I'd come meet somebody. I'd get to know them, see what worked, invent something. But then I leave. And even if there's a long-term relationship with someone, we work together. I understand them. We get the right bar of accommodation in the right place. They're going to work with other people during the day, and most likely they're not going to see me as a professional their entire life. And when students graduate school and move into the adult service agency, that becomes a very significant issue, which then of course means that if I haven't helped you establish some kind of reference tool or some kind of structure that you can carry with you, then you have to start all over again, educating someone else about who you are, most likely with your behavior if you're not able to describe that. So we moved into person-driven strategies after years and years. I'm a permanent student in the School of Hard Knocks. So we're in this together, trudging this happy road, trying to figure out how to get better and better and stay teachable and be informed by the people that we serve in order to keep inventing new ideas and new tools. First, I want to make sure that people know that I have a brain injury. So we're not taking a break because it's just an hour, but I can't track the chat box while I'm presenting. So Jen's going to do that and flag questions if anything comes up. So feel free to use the chat box. I also give information. I'm going to share tools with you. Some of them are directly you can download from our website. We have Creative Commons copyright on our work, and I want to just quickly tell you what that means. I don't want you don't have to call me and say, hey, can I use this tool? It's yours. Take it and use it. There are two requirements. You have to cite us as the author, and you can't get paid outside of your position to teach our work. So you can carry it within your own company. As a teacher, you can share it with other teachers in your school. You cannot get paid to go teach it somewhere else. You can, even under Creative Commons copyright, you can say, I like this part of it, and now we're going to edit it, and we're going to make it our own. That's fantastic. You still have to cite us as the author of the original material. So just a clarification about that. You'll see on the piece that we share with you, we have this little read first, and it explains all of that as well. So I start with, it might seem crazy, but we're going to start with the beginning of time as we know it, where as human beings, we start with this, look at us. We went from the world is flat, no, it's not, to now there are people actually, fighting for the belief that the world is flat. And I have a friend who says, I'd like to see the reality show of them trying to find it. And I think that's a great comment about that. But we as humans have this funny capacity to believe something as absolute truth, and then we are convinced of something else, and that's when we move on that's when we'll move to a new belief system. Ptolemy and Copernicus are old Greek astronomers. Ptolemy thought, looking through the telescopes, that that Earth was actually the center of the universe. And then Copernicus, his younger colleague, came out and said, I think we're part of what's going around the sun. And of course, Copernicus was excommunicated and kicked out of his, excommunicated from the church and kicked out of his career because of it. Now, we, as humans, moved through the Age of Enlightenment, where we started to think, oh, wait a minute, I see that I might not be the center of everything. This anthropomorphism that we as humans are the center of everything, and the biocentrism that I am the center of everything, helped us grow from, oh, the lightning outside isn't happening because I was mean to Jen. It has something to do with something that isn't focused on me. And when we started to make that shift, we started to get perspective. Now, the reason that we're talking about that now, I'm sure you're scratching your head going, am I on the right webinar? Isn't this about autism? This, in our field, I think this human tendency continues to be problematic for us, because we project subjective properties onto other people. I'm going to explain that here. Here's a more current example. So we're not talking about a long time ago. We're talking about in 2003, the sequence of the human genome was fully assembled for the first time, and the scientific community could only understand 3% of it, which was attached to proteins. They gave the scientific name junk DNA to the other 97%. Because we didn't understand it, we called it junk. It's a funny tendency that we have. Now, they've gotten in trouble for it, and they changed the name and etc. But this isn't so long ago. So in this understanding of how we roll as humans, I started to really understand a different lens, because I got involved in deafblindness, and I had been working with students on the spectrum my entire career. But when I started working with deafblind people, everybody on my caseload in my classroom at the time who was diagnosed with autism, back then it was ED and BD, they were all getting better as I was learning to sign tactily. And I could not put it together until later I started really hearing about the research, like I can't remember the lab right now, but Malcolm Gladwell mentions it in his book Blink, the showing film. So there's an audience watching Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And if you don't know the film, if you're young, it's the most toxic relationship you've seen on screen. It's, you know, it's Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton drunk and just it's terribly, difficult to watch. But the audience not on the spectrum are riveted on the facial expressions of the two main characters. The majority of the audience on the spectrum are riveted on a string that's moving on a light bulb in the background. So what I'm doing with visual information, how I'm processing it, how I'm prioritizing it starts to look very different for people. Now, this is where that projection onto others becomes problematic because all the tools I'm building and all of the strategies that I'm using are for people who process like I do. Learning to pay attention is for me the most important piece, to understand that my brain is not made the same as the person I'm serving. How things are processed are not necessarily parallel is the way for me to start to understand where we're still projecting that myth on others. So curiosity rather than conviction, that's my favorite teacher says, more interested in curiosity than conviction. Deafblindness taught me more about autism than anything to this day, to this current day. So part of this means staying
And
fast. Yeah,
sorry, are you moving slides?
I am.
Okay, because we just see the first one, so I just wanted to let you know.
Oh no. Okay, so what should we do about
Perfect.
that? Should we undo and try again? We did a
Yeah.
little trial and it didn't have any trouble. Are you seeing the stay fascinated slide?
Yep, now we're good.
Let me try going back a slide.
Okay.
Can you see the back slide, the one that?
No.
Okay, well, I think what we're going to do is, gosh, this is going to be interesting. How would you let Joe and Jen, what should we do? You want to start over? You want me to send you the PowerPoint and you can run through it? Like this? Sure, let's do that. Okay, that's great. So here's the first slide, just so you get a quick, recap of here's the Copernicus and Tolmay and our gaining perspective and the junk DNA and deafblindness teaching. And here's where we are now, staying fascinated. There's a music conductor named Benjamin Zander, and he teaches this how to give an A class. And there's all kinds of real fun stuff about it. You can look him up on YouTube and watch the whole thing. But here's the piece that really struck me when he was talking is that, here we are in this system that grades people from A to F, and we have this tendency to compare ourselves to everyone else because of it. It's competition. So I can listen to Jen and go, oh, I'll never be as smart as her, and listen to Joe and go, oh, I know so much more than him. Sorry, Joe. I know, I don't mean it. This constant back and forth stops us from learning, really. And he says he decided to try to disrupt that pattern. And what he noticed was when he was not feeling as smart as somebody in the room, or he didn't get something, he had this kind of downward spiral. It would hit his shoulders first. So he throws his hands in the air and yells, fascinating, to try to stop himself from getting down that shame spiral and stay attending to what's in front of him. So when I teach, I like to make sure that everyone is throwing their arms in the air on a regular basis, staying fascinated, because part of this story is I have really blown it before, and I want to stay fascinated in those moments so I can change my own behavior. Here's one of the very clear strategies that have become problematic and that I learned from being around deafblind people. We are taught, if you go to school for psychology, even blindness, to put your hand on top of somebody's hand to teach them something. So I, for example, have a little light clicker here, and I would put my hand on top of yours and I would push on your finger and it would turn the light on and off in the background, and I would teach you how to use it that way. Well, deafblindness teaches us that processing is, your startle reflex lives mostly in your hands, your mouth, and your feet. That's why when you see a baby, they're playing with a toy on their back with the toy in their hands, their mouth, and their feet are all involved in it. And an OT drew this model, homunculus, that shows you sensory weight on the body to emphasize that that's the truth. So when you're putting your hand on top of someone else's, even if they're not startled, internally, they're still trying to figure out what you're trying to do. Danger, Will Robinson, for anyone who's old enough to remember that phrase. You can't focus on what's actually happening in the hand because your anxiety of what do you want, what am I supposed to do here, is too high. So instead, what I want to do is change this habit and offer you something hand under hand and have you learn how to follow me. Now, this transition can be very hard for somebody who's had their hand on top of them their whole life. So give yourself time and operate this with patience and work with other people, other colleagues to get this habit down yourself. If you blindfold each other and try teaching each other something without talking, you will get this in a much shorter period of time because your own nervous system will start to teach you that this hand over hand thing is problematic. So when you put your hand underneath, when you're starting to teach somebody to follow you, then they're feeling the movement, the rhythm, and the moment that they push, the moment that their intrinsic motivation for mastery kicks in and says, oh, I think I understand this. When that happens, I can back off. Oh yeah, you got it. There you go. Here, good. That's exactly it. Now, if they still need more teaching, I can come back in. But teaching this hand under hand strategy changes the dynamic of power. I'm going to stay here as long as you need me. It's not compliance based. You must do it like this. I'm going to let you keep coming forward. And I need that agency. You need that agency for me to really understand your mastery. So I can't emphasize this slide enough. It is the most important change that happened in my career. And you will see, when I get called out into different classrooms or residential sites or vocational sites to do training or to work with someone whose behavior is escalated so high that the team is bringing in a specialist to try to address it. I can't tell you what I hear more often than anything else is, wow, he never does that for us. That looks like magic. I've been in the field a long time. So when I was young, I was like, yeah, I'm really good at what I do. And then the tragedy struck for me to realize that, wow, the right accommodation is so far away from you that it looks like magic when it shows up. There's nothing about me in this story. There's really just starting to understand why we're stuck where we're stuck. We're going to get into that soon too. So there's some other things that really fascinated me. There's some moments where I had big fascination. For anybody who doesn't know John and Julie Gottman, they run an institute. They're in Seattle. They have trainers all over the world, and they hold workshops all over the world for couples. They're known as the relationship experts. John is most famous for being able to meet you and your partner and with over 90% accuracy predict whether or not you're going to be together in 5 years. Some people want to meet them, some people don't want to meet them. So fascinating work, highly recommend everybody check that out, but that's a different workshop. Here's what I got out of their work. Their research says that the first 3 minutes of the interaction are going to determine the outcome of the interaction, regardless of what I try to do in the middle. So how I bring this to you, how I start the interaction is of the most powerful moment. Now, this became really problematic because then, I'm sure many of you already know this book, The Reason I Jumped by Naoki Higashida. And it's one child's perspective from the lens of autism. There are certainly other lenses, so he doesn't speak for everybody on the spectrum by any means, but there's great insight from this young man. And the whole book is laid out in Q&A. Why do you flap your hands? Why do you jump? And then he gives his perspective. But here's the one that gave me the fascinating moment I needed. If someone's talking to me from far off, I don't notice. And you're probably thinking, same here, right? Well, a major headache for me is that even when someone's right here in front of me, I still don't notice they're talking to me. So it would help us a great deal if you would just use our names first to get our attention before you start talking to us. This changed my career as well, just like the hand under hand. This pivoted my understanding about something. Because when I'm talking to Jen, I'm not using her name, every time I'm bringing a new idea to her, engaging with her, because she's using her vision to process that Jennifer White is in front of her. And we already started to talk about vision. The visual nerve for folks on the spectrum is doing something different for many people than it is for the rest of the population. It's vital to understand that. Because when I started using people's names when I was in front of them, it changed the game. It also gave me reflection to see that all this time I've been diagnosing somebody's incapacity to do something. Because in that first 3 minutes, when they're not with me, I've started to teach them something they can't follow. And I assume it's because they don't have the capacity to process that new tool, or they have a different learning curve, instead of understanding that I, in fact, haven't oriented to them the way they need to onboard with me to start the teaching. Fascinating, right? Fascinating. So the examination of our own systemic structures is the beginning place. And then my own personal moments of, oh, I see how this has played out over the years. Being involved in deafblindness has been the boon of my life. I tell you, deafblind people have taught me more than anything I know about most things. And when I look at my career, and I work with people, across all disabilities, I look at modality loss, like processing loss, because I see a parallel in how this works. So I'm going to talk about processing loss as like mind deafness, mind blindness. So even though you might not be working with somebody who's deaf or blind or deafblind, what happens in the brain, how you take information in, how the information travels to your brain, what the brain does with it, and how it travels back out is impacted in some similar ways, or there's some good lessons to take from this. First of all, there's a research study back in the 70s that a lot of folks teaching in blindness cited about how we learn what we learn, how you know what you use nowadays, where did you get it from? 92% of what you're using in your brain, you learned incidentally. It was around you. Now, there's structure to how we teach kids and how we learn language and all of that, but that's a minuscule speck on how your brain actually takes in and gathers information. So incidentally, 92% my brain is putting it together. 6% I'm learning from other people. I see Joe touch the, boy, Joe, I'm gonna pick on you today. I see him touch the fire. He's crying, his hand hurts. I don't have to touch the fire now because I've watched Joe do it. So that's 6% other people's experiences. 2% of what you retain in your lifetime, somebody taught you intentionally. Our whole school system, right? It's a funny thing about. So what that also really tells us is that what is around, the model that is around someone is vital. So if they're not processing spoken language, or if they're not processing visual information in the same way we are, I have to be thoughtful about the model around them, which means I also don't want to just set up structure for the student. I want to set up structure for the staff that also models it. And this is really helpful because universal design is accessible to all people. And the structure for people for processing issues is the common brain, what we were all born with. All of us were born with a pre-linguistic brain, and it processes the same way. It doesn't matter where you were born or what your modality loss is. Because blindness, even if you're fully blind, structure of matter is the same as your tactile experience. So we want to really take a look at our environments and our delivery and our practices. And I'll give you a couple of concrete models coming up. Sugata Mitra is another research study that gave me some fascinating moments. He's the man from India who did the research study about the importance of the right teacher with the right skills teaching the right thing to the right kids. And he is from India, so in his research, he went to a very small village that hadn't yet seen computers, and he mud and taped one into the wall so that nobody could get to the back of it. He taught the kids how to turn it on and how to use the mouse and how to get online to find some games. And then he left. And a month later, he came back. How did you like the computer? Oh, we don't use it anymore. And he's thinking, all right, I'm going to be the international expert on this cool new topic. And then he asks his second question, why? And he said, well, we programmed it into our first language. We found all the games. But once you get good at the game, they want to charge you money to play a better game. We don't have money to pay for those games. And he was blown away by the fact that the kids had actually taught each other. And he changed his focus in his career to environments rich in access, motivation and access. So accessibility of a model, emphasizing the tactile and kinesthetic dimensions, and universal design structured on the pre-linguistic brain. Those are the things that started to impact my teaching. So I do these exercises, and this is an exercise I love for people to take with them. It is based in knowledge from the deaf community as well. You'll see if you have any background in deafness, and when we do this version in ASL, that this is the structure of the visual language in America and in most visual languages in the world. because when we start to try to describe things to each other without formal language, and I've asked Jen to be my model here, if she doesn't mind, and she's been willing, the exercise is literally to sit across from someone, and the one person is going to be able to see the screen. The person describing the picture is going to be able to see the picture that I hold up. And then the other person has their back to it. And then the game is no language. You can't sign, you can't talk, you can't tap Morse code. Whispering is language. I'm just going to tell you, a lot of people like forget. You get so frustrated, you want to get your point across. You'll start to whisper. So the exercise is to describe to the person using no language visually what it is that you have on screen. So Joe has agreed to be our recipient. Jen has agreed to be the person describing. So Joe, I'm going to ask you to just put your head down for a second. Tell me when you're done. Okay. Now, sure. This actually isn't going to work with, let me just take this off for a second because we're not running the slides. So Jen, this is the picture that we want you to describe to Joe. All right, so take it in for a second. And remember, you can't talk. You're just going to use your hands to try to describe this. All right. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that we see Jen a little better. And I want you to just try to describe that no language. Nope, you're going to hang tight until she's done, and then you're going to tell us what she's described. Okay, that's good. Joe, are you getting anything? A square and a wave? Okay. Okay, so we're going to stop right there, and I'm going to show you the picture. And Jen, first
Sorry,
of all,
I'm so bad.
no, round of applause, woman. We are used to linguistic explanation, right? So trying to get things visual is a challenge for us. And this is the fascinating thing, to remember that we really are challenged by this. So let me just cut this out of here and say, here's the picture that Jen had to describe. Now, most of us, when we're describing that, start with the tornado. Most people you'll see like do this tornado, and then the relationship to the house becomes challenging. Or you saw Jen like trying to struggle about the relationship between these two things. Visual languages do this really well. Spoken languages are chunky and clunky about it. If you start with the house and then you have this thing swirling in the background, you can start to put the relationship between these two things together. Here's this structure, here's something happening. Uh-oh, the structure is starting to strain. You can see that relationship. But again, our habits are not built that way. So we use this to talk about English is like a movie. You start at the beginning, you get to the end. The visual brain is like a newspaper. So for example, I can say this time I'll pick on Jen instead of Joe. Here the movie opens and there's a path down into the woods, and we see Jen walking down the woods. It's midnight. We see the moon in the sky and the owl hooting, and we're like, Jen, don't go in there by yourself. Now, we don't know what's going to happen to Jen or the lesson from what happens to Jen till the end of the movie, right? But in the visual brain, it starts in an opposite order. It says, here is the end game. Jen abducted by aliens to teach lessons of world peace to humanity. Now my brain knows what we're focusing on, and I can collect the details in relationship to that topic so I can understand as I'm going through the entire experience. So when we look at, like, oftentimes people in this exercise will think of the Wizard of Oz because that's what's in their file cabinet. That's what they relate to in that experience. But my experience doesn't relate to the same, experience of the students and adults that I work with. And I'll give you a good example of that. I worked with a man on the spectrum who had vision loss. He was deafblind, and whether he was on the spectrum or not, I don't know, but he was diagnosed there. So, and he was living at the institution, and I had been subbing there for the summer in the rec program. And he moved from a very isolated small town in Arkansas. He'd never been to school, and he had some residual vision. And so I was using visuals with him and sign with him, and he was picking things up really quickly. It was so exciting. Here's the calendar. We're Xing off days. I'm starting to bring pictures in so he can here's what's going to happen tomorrow, and here are the days that I'm coming. And he's just so excited because he really is a bright guy. And he's never been to school. So I have a picture of a school bus on the calendar because, again, I'm creating the tools based on my brain. He's getting excited because he's seeing the school bus. We get to the first day of school. I go to pick him up, and he's outside with his fishing pole and his sleeping bag. Because where he lived, the old dilapidated school bus was used to pick up kids to go to the fishing hole and to go camping. So what's in the brain, how people are interpreting it, all right. So that becomes a whole different experience, or a whole different aspect of what I need to pay attention to as well. What's in your file cabinet, and then how do you organize that information? I'm going to go through the other strategy, you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, and it's going to have information about other pictures and some other points about it. So you can play this game. I recommend that people, if you're a staff or if you're a family, once a week at least have silent, 15 minutes where somebody has brought a picture and they're trying to describe it to everybody else. Same rules apply. You all have access to this pre-linguistic brain. It's something that makes sense to all of us. Language, English in particular, gets in the way of that structure. So the more you practice stopping talking, the more that old information will come back to you. I love this quote by George Bernard Shaw, that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And most of us, as the provider, as the teacher, as the parent, we are the ones assuming that that person across from us is processing like we are. And we get into the mucky muck of what's actually not happening. So when we look at tools in America, every single tool to evaluate language skill, except for what's come out of the Gallaudet University in ASL, finally, right, in the last 30 years, every single tool is based on English structure, even if it's a visual tool, like the California Picture Vocabulary Test, which is normed on kids with hearing loss and is very visual, or all pictures. The milestones are still English. So when we talk about all the way back at the beginning of when we met, that projection of the myth on the other person, here we are. Fascinating. I am continuing to perpetuate this challenge. It's like saying the kid in the wheelchair, I'm going to keep working on teaching you how to walk up those stairs every year. Now, when it's a physical disability, that's easy for us to understand that that's not the right accommodation. But when it's a processing issue, we systemically haven't really gotten that far on understanding that. I like to do this little poll of asking people how many of you are social justice workers. I've been teaching communication strategies for 30 plus years, and it used to be that nobody would raise their hand, to a smattering of a few hands, to nowadays there are a lot of hands that go up. But here's the impetus of why I asked that question is, how do you describe your job? When Aunt Sally comes to dinner and you haven't seen her since you were a kid, and she says, well, what are you doing now for a living? Here's my elevator speech. I level the playing field for people with disabilities, the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. And I think most of you would agree that's our job. This is what we're doing. And what's the definition of social justice? To level the playing field for people in marginalized groups to have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. So then it really starts to help us understand that we are in fact social justice workers. There's this great book, Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment by Leticia Nieto. And in it, she defines the categories of marginalization in our country. And this is our history of oppression. It's a great book. It teaches lots of great lessons in very simple language. The tagline for the book is "Strategies to Free Us All." Highly recommend that as well. But here's the fascinating moment for me. We might come up with a really cool tool that really works, teaching hand under hand or making video resumes. It's fantastic. And I can train a team and they're all on board and they have phenomenal experience. Somebody gets hired, the employer says, wow, that was so much better than my experience before. The person gets to connect right with the employer right away when they meet. It's just profound, literally profound. But then when I come back a month later, the iPad has been sitting on the desk or the shelf that entire time because it's not integrated into the system. We're literally walking upstream to try to integrate new tools and new perspectives. So one of the pieces that this taught me about was really understanding that where we are in time, right? We're relatively new. When I was in school, and I'm 60 now, when I was in school, special ed was one classroom. There was no resource room. All kids were put together who couldn't, make it in the classroom that everybody else was in, process the same, or make it in the way they process, is how I should say it. There was a separate class. When my mother was in school, special education was in a different building. When my grandmother was in school, there was no special education. So 3 generations in, right now 4 generations, because people younger than me, we're trying to understand this, and it's still fairly new. The generation of students that I work with now are the first generation of students who are actually integrated in settings that include kids with disabilities. So oftentimes when I'm working on a school project, I engage those peers because they know how to do something that I don't know how to do. I never had to do it. In fact, they're kind of social justice workers by nature, because there's really nobody who understands social justice issues and oppression more than a teenager, because they're expected to act like an adult and they don't yet have those rights. So it's a very right population for engagement and collaboration around these projects. So we're working together to put the bar in the right place, but we don't really have that down yet. And this is a good time to be an inventor and stay fascinated. I don't want to drag the same problems forward that we've been, having all of this time. There's exercises in this. I'd like to do this exercise with SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Managers. And for families, this can be helpful when you're educating other people around you. I draw these 5 concentric circles and have people write their family in the middle, and their best friends, and then their friends and colleagues, community, and then the people at large in the world, like, Michelle Obama, Brad Pitt, A-Rod, people that you see but don't have connection with. Mostly people on TV and in magazines. And then we go backwards and go, well, was there anybody with a disability anywhere? And it's typically in the family and workplace, not in how you think about the world at large or your community or other places. Now that's starting to change, but this social justice model really gets reinforced in this exercise, because the thing that changes that, of course, is time, exposure, and education. So let's look back at 50 years ago. Could you easily marry someone from a different race? It wouldn't even have come to mind for most people. And 100 years ago, could you easily think of marrying someone from a different spiritual practice or religion? Because it's not in the environment. When we talk about accessibility and needing the model, that 92% of what you know is going to inform all of this. So we want to, again, really reinforce the environments that we're looking at. In his famous work on the subject, Erickson, the famous psychologist, said, self-concept is the rudimentary definition of self. It's based on a collection of disconnected traits. The self-concept relies on role models to suggest the standards of preferences. So you have to include, for me and my models, I have to include adults interacting and navigating the world who function and process in similar ways. So in deafblindness taught me that as well. If we're talking about a deafblind child, the team doesn't even know how to interact with the deafblind child, but a deafblind person comes into the room and something changes the game. It teaches us how to interact. We have the right model. The student sees the right model right away. I have 1,000 stories. I'm going to try not to tell them all so we can get through all of this. Smart screen technology, now a tool of the masses. So here we are. Now we're talking about something that's already in everybody's environment. So here's a key opportunity for us to capitalize on how to bring material into and forward into the environments that we're working in. I'm going to skip a couple of these slides because, again, you're going to have copy and you can read them. There are 2 areas that I focus on regularly: communication and money, because they're both areas of power, and they're both areas that traditionally people with developmental disabilities don't have access to, don't have the same access to. So I talk about it like this, especially for somebody who might communicate mostly with behavior and less with language. There's somebody who, in our system, again, we're all trying to do the right thing, but typically people are managed all day long to try to fit into the structures that we have, that process like I do. And so what happens oftentimes when I'm working with somebody with a really significant disability is it's helpful to think about them like the feral child. They have spent their life moving back into the woods because we are not reliable to standardize, give them in a standardized way what they need if they don't share our processing or communication strategies. So if I go like this, and Jen thinks it means I want my mom, and Joe thinks it's self-stim, and somebody else thinks I'm hungry, then every one of you is going to react differently to me. So that lack of standardization means I'm going to pull back because I'm going to take care of myself as much as I can. You guys are not that reliable. Now, we want to strategize how to get standardized, but also how to understand that if that person has had a lifetime of it, and I think about them like the feral child, if I'm going to bring something new, a new tool, then one, I want to be really efficient at it, because if I'm floundering, how much time does the feral child give me to try to get in and do something new? It has to be motivating, it has to be clear, it has to be available to them. So we're going to look at what is motivating to start with. Number one, I meet somebody and I want to know what they love the most. And we're going to connect the dots to that. Exposure, it's got to be around, the model's got to be around, like we talk about. So we say, I see it, so be it. If it's around me, I know that it's true. And then education, we want to look at person-driven tools, which help us shift, how do we get out of the way, essentially? How do we build a structure where you can rely on yourself more than you rely on me, because we've got reference tools built in. The doctor who worked with Helen Keller said to Annie Sullivan, her teacher, if a house collapsed in on a child, all of us would come running with pitchforks and shovels, and no one would stop digging until the child was found. And that's our task here, to keep digging until we find the child. And he was talking about Helen Keller. I think that's what we do for a living. I think with the systemic rubble that was built, by people without disabilities, for people with disabilities, have built in some structures that are problematic. And that rubble, I have to recognize what that is to help shift it. When I ask people, what do you think is the most common challenge for students with disabilities after high school, there's a real variety of answers. Here's the experience. Self-advocacy. I don't know how to ask for what I need. I don't know how to educate you about what I need. I'm pretty much going to be thrown into a new system, and now I'm going to use behavior or communication or whatever I have. When I work with individuals with significant disabilities in particular, I see there are two categories of overdeveloped personality traits. And we all have all personality traits and can, go, move on the spectrum of all kinds of emotions during a day and behaviors during a day. But these two things are overdeveloped. As a communication specialist, I can tell you that what I see more often than anything else is somebody who is now passive and going along and smiling all the time, because that's all there is. I'm going to follow you. The other is, if you come near me with anything, I'm going to kill you with my eyelash if I can. Get out. Like, I'm going to be a fighter. Now, both of those are reactions to extreme lack of control. So when you're talking about marginalization, this is the direct cause of a lack of self-advocacy and an overdevelopment of those two other strategies. So I'm going to skip that and just say we have some low-tech tools that we focus on that allow people to take and capture their own pictures. I appreciate PECs. I appreciate Proloquo. I appreciate systems that we have built. And there's the operative sentence, we have built. I like putting tools in people's hands who build it themselves, because I see I get a different understanding of the person. I start to understand how they process, how they take pictures, even tells me what they're looking at. But the capacity to capture something when it happens, say, for example, we go to Starbucks and order our drinks, and then we have a portable camera and printer, we take a picture, we label it. Tomorrow we go back and we don't talk, we just hand that to the barista, and we're getting exactly what we want using this visual system. That means that you have the most concrete connection to what this thing meant because you created it and you're using it. And I find that can work for a lot of people who haven't been successful with more English-based models or models that were built by someone else. So these are really concrete tools. We have a whole kit that we put together and recommend for people. You're certainly welcome to reach out to me if you want to know more about the low-tech stuff. We're not really going to get too much into that, but starting by even, here's an event, we're going to take the camera with us, we're going to put basic English to it. This is actually a book for a deaf student that we made who lives out on the tundra in Alaska. ASL should be in video, but this was before we had, mobile devices. So we made books with him. He became the photographer, and man, this kid's language grew exponentially, and his motivation to come to school at all. So I like to do this because it also teaches us, right, that telling stories across environments is a big injury for a lot of people. Reed can go on this trip where he gets to be a cowboy and he loves, Bonanza and everything cowboy. That's his, his personality. Now I knew that about him. His dad calls him Hoss, but I didn't know that he had this skill set. I didn't know that he went on this trip. But we started using this camera and printer with him, and he started telling stories across environments that started to change the capacity to connect with him. Now, this is the basis for developing all natural supports in your communities, in your schools, in your workplace, with peers, all of it, because this is also how we all do it. Now, we all do it electronically. We're going to talk about that next. But this telling stories across environments from one place where something happens to another place with a new person who wasn't there is a very powerful place to start. Telling stories across environments and making books or videos, we're going to talk about that soon, are a very good way to start teaching the technology. Most people like to, not like most of us adults who didn't grow up with this technology, most kids really like being the star of everything that they're creating. So no problem, there. And if I'm working with an older person or with anyone who doesn't want to be the subject, we teach them to be the videographer and to interview people and all kinds of other stuff. Now, this moves quickly into the workplace. You're going to see.
Can I ask you a quick question, Jen, before you move on?
Sure.
We have a question from Brittany Daniels. She wants to know, are you going to talk about any specific tools people use to learn how to cook, like written instructions at the same time as photos in a step-by-step way?
We are, in fact, we're 3 slides away from that. Good timing.
Ooh, okay.
Good anticipation,
Thank
Brittany.
you.
That's great. Absolutely. So just to note that here's another injury, right? Here's another we project on other people. When you look at communication systems, you look at Brittany wants to cook, right? And we have a picture of Brittany and we've made up something to mean want and then cooking. And we've got those 3. So now when we're talking about the visual brain, remember the order is going to look different. It's really just going to start with the cooking picture. And it's also not going to have Brittany in it. So the storytelling pictures have the individuals, right? It's pictures of me. But once I start to make tools for me to track, I'm the photographer. So it's from my point of view. This is Reed's, before we had technology, before we had iPads, took pictures with his boss of all of his tasks. And then when he finished them, he would propel through the day by moving it to the right-hand side to say that it was finished. Now, Reed was deemed unemployable when we met him by school, BR, DDA, and 2 other agencies who'd worked with him ahead of time. And as soon as he was able to be the author of the structure, boom, he took off. Not only that, but his colleagues know how to operate the system too. So if they have a new task, they say, hey, Reed, come bring the camera. And then they would take new photos. Or something changed that day, they'd go to this system and say, we're not going to do this, or I need this first. Or at a glance, the colleagues can see what's been done for the day as well. Now, this then moves into cooking. I skipped a slide there that breaks the visuals down even more, but you all can read that on your own. It's not necessary to understand measurements to learn how to cook. When I work with students and adults, cooking is very motivating for many, many people. And I work with a lot of adults who live in residential services where they're not allowed in their kitchens. So we work hard on trying to develop, we work on smoothies first. Smoothies are a great way to structure how to, sequence, and again, using the color-coded structures, it means you don't have to learn how to measure. Now, I'm not going to get into our low-tech teaching tools, but Brittany, if you want to reach out to me, I have a whole PowerPoint on teaching the teaching strategies and organizational strategies for cooking, and it also has some recipes in it, 3 ingredient recipes that are really simple. In fact, Jen, I'll just send that to you and you can make that available to everybody. All right. So Brittany, thanks for bringing that up. So there's the communication piece. I get somebody to be the author of it. And then we've got concrete models of money. How do when I work with people and we want to embed access to understanding earnings, the most common thing I hear is, well, he doesn't care. He'd rather have a quarter than $100 bill. It doesn't matter. The structure needs to include you do something, you earn something, you do something, you earn something, and that accumulates so you have earned enough to buy the thing that you've identified as motivating. Putting those dots together, this was another fascinating moment for me. I've worked in vocational rehab my entire career, and it didn't dawn on me to put money into the strategy, even when somebody's practicing, even when somebody's volunteering, even when I'm training students, because the difference between work and everything else is earnings and the power to do something with that earning. What is happening in most places is we're dragging the feral child into the workplace, and now we're measuring their capacity to comply with us. That's the outcome I'm getting until I put money in. So this is Trep. He's one of my favorite people to talk about. Trep, when we met him, was staffed 3 people to 1 because he's the behavior master. That guy is going to get anything he wants. Doesn't matter if there's a football team trying to stop him. Now, we used the camera and printer, found out what was motivating for him. He likes Coke. It's one of the things that he signs drunk, so don't sign like he does, but he likes Coke. And so we took the camera and printer, went to the restaurant, we ordered it, labeled it, he started ordering it himself. It changed the game. 3 people who used to walk around him are now trying to keep up with him as he's running to the restaurant because with picture in hand, because he's ready to order and get what he wants. And then we find a place across the street that sells something else. And then we teach choice making. And now this camera and printer is serving him. He likes it. He knows he's going to get power in this system. So we go to a workplace, the library system, where we volunteer, but we put money into it. In our resources, we have a request letter that you can use to write to the Rotary Club or the VFW Alliance Club, wherever you can look for donations. And it essentially says, look, you and I met our first employer and knew right away that the relationship was different. Trep hasn't had the opportunity to put together that production equals earnings. So we want $200 for the year. This was our original version. So it was a money jig, right? We're using these money jigs. And $1 would buy, he'd be able to walk next door to Starbucks and buy a hot chocolate for 60 something cents. That's how long ago that was. Because now, of course, you can make these for as much money as needed. But the goal is, how do I, in a most clear, concrete way, I've got a photo of the task, a photo of the quarter, a photo of the next task, a photo of the quarter, etc. He would finish, he would walk next door and he would buy his hot chocolate. Connecting those dots changed his work performance. On a day when he came to work agitated, we know it's the change of the season, he didn't sleep well, he's exhibiting all the things that we know, it's not going to go well. He stood up and said bye, which means we're out, like run to the car. And I held up the money jig and said, we can be done, but we don't have money to buy the hot chocolate. And he sat down and in a foul mood finished his job so that he could get the money to buy his own stuff. Now, you have to understand that he's a guy who has hot chocolate at home and can get it anytime he wants. It's the power of money that changed this game. From there, he moved into self-employment. That's a long, cool story I'd love to tell you some other time. And he's using an iPad now, but he still needs the money jig to get the concrete money in his hand. So I'm going to move on from there into he used job development notebooks with everybody with visual or written information. So again, they are tracking their own information. When we work with people who are wanting to hand out their own resumes to employers, we ask them to, if they're interested, to include this sample advocacy letter that essentially explains our services so people can still reach out on their own and we are represented. And then also, I'm just going to stop for a second, Jen, and say, is it okay if we go a little over here? Is it okay if we go a little?
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So when high tech came out, we had the opportunity to put together an accumulation of all of those clunky tools we've been, trying to invent as we went along into something that was a little bit more accessible and streamlined. So what we do when we meet people now is look at how they're using their smart devices, or if they have a smart device. And here's a good point about marginalization. Here's something that makes it very clear. You and I have had this in our hands since it was available 11 years ago. We've had iPads in our hands for 11 years and smartphones even longer than that. How many people with developmental disabilities have access to that? And I can tell you in the adult world, a minimal amount. So why is that? Because it's expensive and we're afraid it's going to break, but it is a tool of accommodation that like no other. and it's used by the masses. So the model is here. I mean, I don't have to know how to do everything because the 14-year-old in the room and the 7-year-old in the room, and right, there's just a lot of modeling going on. So we are looking at, when, if you're a teacher or a family member or a provider, a vocational provider, a community provider, ask these questions. How is somebody using, how are you using your device? And then how do we help somebody else use a device in the same way? We are big users of photo and film because, again, it gives agency to the person to be the author of what it is they're capturing and telling stories about. We use it for person-centered plans. We use it for video resumes, self-advocacy film, video brochures, customer film files. And then during quarantine, we actually have people taking a picture every week of some experience that represents their quarantine, and they've made films out of it. It's exquisite storytelling. That, how do you join the conversation? I'm going to tell you right now too that Jen's going to provide you with a tech blog that I wrote from the National Technical Assistance Center, and it actually has links to tools to gain access to how do I make a video resume and how do I, all of these different things. And it also has a 2-part film in it. There's a passworded page that you can go to, and you can see people using these tools. We just don't have time to do it together. This is video resumes. Employers tell us, I can see a potential employee rather than barriers. You can see directly that Jesse gets to connect with the employer, and the employer can look right at Jesse to point something out. Our current model is I am talking on behalf of Jesse to the employer. So this shift also changes employers' capacity to see a potential employee. It's easy to include, you'll see on our website, Sarah gives a lovely recommendation to one of the students that she's helping with, been supporting in his video resume. Note-taking apps, besides camera and printer, we use note-taking apps a lot because you can take pictures and draw on them and type and move things around. So we use those for lots of things. Notability is the one we've been using for years that we like, but it's also a really cool tool for somebody trying to capture the steps of things. Here's how I do it. I walk around with the employer, they're adding tasks. I can take photos while I'm going along, and if I have the capacity, I can type words to it like, am I understanding this correctly? And send it to them in email saying, am I understanding this correctly? So ways to capitalize on retention and comprehension of expectations. And then video time or FaceTime and video calls we use to help with travel training. Because of course, as a parent, do you want your kid to get on a bus? What's going to happen? So we teach people to, at specific landmarks, FaceTime their team or their family so that they know where they are en route. There are a lot of apps now for safe travel training as well. We're not going to get too deeply into that, but mapping apps also are great for training travel because they're maps that you can draw on. We invented an app called Work Autonomy, and I'm going to suggest you go to our website to learn more about it because there's a whole page with a film of people using it in different ways. It's also in that password protected film. On the second film, you'll see people using the app and giving feedback about it. But it has 3 sections, and it allows people to capture using video, photo, text, and sound how they process, like, how am I going to remember this? And then structure it in order of here's the game, here's what I'm working on, here's the breakdown of steps so that I can complete that. There's a timer and a counter that feed a chart. So this is Eric. Eric is in this picture here on the right-hand side. Who's the first time he was asked, how do you like using the app? He said, I like using the app because the job coach can go away, which is exactly what we want. So here's an example of it running. Here, Eric is building trays for the ICU here, and here's what the tray looks like when it's done. And then underneath it are all the steps he needs in video, photo, text, or sound to help him get to that success. While it's running, there's a timer. This one shows that there are 4 more of tray number 1 that need to be built because he's clicking it off. It can run up or down, the timer can run up or down, and the clock typically shows you the end of your shift so you know when you're going home, just like the rest of us need that information. And then it's producing a chart that can get sent to the employer or to the family or to the school staff, etc. There's another chart that's connected around production, so you can, or around earnings. So even if somebody's not earning, you can put in the amount that they would earn, and somebody can look at how to start to understand more concrete terms what they're earning. And then we have a worksheet attached that helps people work on budgeting. Financial literacy is so powerful. I have a list of other apps we love to use. I'm going to leave you to explore those on your own. And then also just to note that working on screens, as we all know, right, is extremely challenging for lots of reasons. And in that tech blog, it takes you to a page on our website where we have 3 training tools that you can take and use with anybody around the shift for your staff, to the content that you can actually teach over Zoom instead of in person when you need to do that, and then also mental health. So that are addressing those things, please use them. But the thing that I want to make sure is clear is you'll see that my background is a little gray. It's not white. It's not black on white. That's to help your eyes not have to work so hard. We also use Arial or Helvetica font because the curves have more pixelation than other fonts, which also makes your eyes work a little bit less. So to note that you can see in comparison that other versions are harder on your eyes. So we want to give you good models. Contrast is also very helpful. And lighting is really helpful. So you want to be front lit on the subject. So we teach these basic things. We have a template for, how to actually do in virtual things. Like we have a template now because everybody's lost their rhythms and their structures. So we put it together every single class. Doesn't matter what we're teaching. We start with check-in. We did a little self-care share. We check in about COVID, and then we get into our content. And we teach concepts about COVID so people stay current. And we do things like sharing stories. What did you do last night? I saw a bear in my yard. That's actually a picture from my yard. There was a bear in my yard. And then we go back on, take turns, and we literally share photos, over our phones or our devices next to our face. And then you have to teach people to, not take it down too quickly and to make sure that they're in the shot too. And okay, so now I'm going to move into work. And we're going to go through this like a fire hose, but I want to give you some really key points about employment. We have worked very hard on understanding what people with disabilities need over the last couple of decades, how to individualize services so it meets the person. We haven't really looked at the employer very well. We do a lot of handshake relationship building there, but we don't really think like business people. So we look a lot at business-minded tools. We took a poll because we looked at system supports, families, providers of vocational services, and people with disabilities themselves. What do you think is the biggest barrier for people with disabilities getting employed? We overwhelmingly think it is the employer's lack of awareness or the employer's attitudes. We did the same poll with employers. They overwhelmingly say, I don't have the time or the money. I want to do it. That tells us that we've taught them a capacity model. This is a special project instead of a business strategy that's going to help them meet their bottom line. So we're going to talk about some tools that help us make that shift. First of all, I have to understand that my boss is somebody, right, is going to be key in this employment story. A family has a child with a disability. Most people plan for that. And so there's creating new dreams and that whole journey of what it is to understand the new life that you're going to have. And then your child goes to school and you have a teacher and a paraprofessional who are helping your child realize those goals. And then they move into work with a coach who looks and acts just like the para and just like the parent. Employers look at us like we're messy on the job site because we're messy on the job site. We try to keep them from their employee because we're afraid it's not going to look like every other employee. So we're going to talk about some practices that help integrate that and help employers understand why this is such a powerful thing to do. So the video resume is the first thing, right? I want somebody to represent themselves. We have a project with a local hospital, now St. Michael's, used to be called Harrison Medical Center, where we wrote a project specifically to target people with more significant disabilities. And in it, we've built a lot of business model tools. So here's one of the most important ones. When we're looking at supporting the hospital in their structures, we get on site and take a look at the work floor, what's coming in, what's going out, services and products. And we look at the streamline of that. And then we look at the cost to them of how they're managing those things. We have this in an autofill spreadsheet. So if you need a copy of it, let me know, reach out to me, because we do things like, okay, we call it a smart hire in this autofill sheet for your all's purposes, but it's a win supported employee in this project. And if they're working 40 hours a week and we start them at $16.50 an hour, which is what Eric started at in his position 6 years ago now. He started at $16.50 6 years ago. Because the supervisor and the warehouse clerk who are doing it currently are paid more an hour. Not because Eric's work is not worth what everybody else is doing, but because those other employees are cross-trained. They have more sophisticated things that they have to do in their job. So we want to pull off the pieces that we can, that we can build and offer to support that person to use their time in those more sophisticated tasks and do this financially in a smarter way for the company. This is how we work with employers around decisions on all work floors. We keep cost analysis on all of our with all of our employees. In fact, when this hospital was bought out by another hospital, the entire new HR team came in. And one of my first conversation with the director, she said, "We don't have time for special projects. We're evolving too much. We're not going to be able to keep this program." And I tried not to freak out and said, "I need 15 minutes of your time. I understand that you're probably used to the Jerry's Kids model, right? This is not what we're doing. We have a business-minded structure. This is not charity in any way." She gave me the 15 minutes. I brought in cost analysis for every position, and she studied them and said, "Can you do this for us at these other two hospitals?" Because the math makes sense. We use math to break the myth, right? The math makes sense. This is the bottom line. So when I'm talking to employers, even when I'm working with agencies on these business model tools, we have a business pitch we put together based on the mission of the company that matches the mission of what you're trying to do. You build the PowerPoint as an accommodation to the employer that you're talking to, because they're going to need it to take it to their leadership as well. So we build accommodations for the employee and we build accommodations for the employer, because both of them have been marginalized from a model where people are integrated into a healthy structure that includes a business model. Because you're going to see the numbers here become very profound very quickly. The math works even if somebody is working at 50% capacity of someone else. The math works. All right. So the other thing is, on a constant basis, because we know it's a systemic issue, on a constant basis, we have to keep asking ourselves, where am I queuing? Where am I stepping in? Those are the places where I want to keep thinking about, can I invent a tool? Is there an accommodation that's going to help me shift? Am I working for the person? Am I encouraging the person to work based on me? I'm essentially become their cheerleader to perform. How do we shift it to money or communication or direct relationships so that they're satisfying their own need with structures they can take with them across environments? All right. We also have a standard operating procedure that I wrote specifically for employers to learn how to work with us so that they can mandate the structures that they need to run a healthy business, so that if the Goodwill comes in or the school district comes in or Able Opportunities comes in, it doesn't matter. They're going to get the same thing and they know it. All right, the last slide I have here is from Einstein, who said, "In matters of truth and justice, there's no difference between large and small problems, for issues concerning the treatment of people are all the same." So my fascinated people here, it's very nice to be here in New Jersey. I hope there was something today that you could take and implement. I do know that this was the fire hose version of here's a whole bunch of things to think about. And like I said, Jen's going to follow up with some resources for you. And feel free to reach out anytime. We are all in this together, trying to shift this story of marginalization that has stopped us from really creating models that are bringing us the outcomes that we really want to see and that the people that we serve really deserve. So Jen, thanks so much for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Like Jennifer said, we'll share everything. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to follow up with us. All right. Thank you so much.